Velociraptor pack protects human child from danger. What follows is incredible. How will this story unfold? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. The jungle seemed endless. Sunlight filtered through a dense canopy, painting the ground in dappled gold and green. A low hum of life buzzed everywhere. The calls of exotic birds, the chatter of insects, the rustling of unseen creatures in the undergrowth. Amid the vastness of the untamed wilderness, a lone figure stood out. A small boy, no older than 6, wearing a wrinkled khaki shirt and dark shorts, his bare feet caked with mud. His name was Tommy. He had no idea how long he'd been wandering. His legs ached with every step. His breaths came quick and shallow, and his tear-streaked face was streaked with dirt. Hours, or maybe days, had blurred together into a stretch of endless green. He had lost his family during an unexpected trip gone horribly wrong. One moment he was exploring near the camp, and the next he was alone. Tommy paused, rubbing his eyes. He looked around, disoriented, spinning in slow circles as he tried to figure out which way he had come from. Everything looked the same: towering ferns, gnarled tree trunks, and shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly between them. "Mom," he called again, his small voice trembling as it echoed through the jungle. Silence answered him, except for a distant rumble. Tommy froze. The sound returned, low and rhythmic. He held his breath, trying to make sense of it. It was unlike anything he'd ever heard. Thudding, almost like drums but heavier. The ground trembled beneath his feet with each passing beat, and his small frame shivered with the vibration. Tommy's wide eyes scanned the trees, his heart pounding. Suddenly, a branch cracked in the distance. Then another. Something was coming. Before he could move, a deafening roar shattered the air, and a massive shape burst through the trees. Tommy stumbled back, falling onto the dirt as an enormous creature. Something straight out of nightmares emerged. It was a T-Rex. Its hulking body towered above him, casting an impossibly long shadow that swallowed Tommy whole. The creature's scaly hide glistened in the sunlight, and its yellow eyes locked onto him. Hot breath poured from its nostrils as it exhaled, the ground quaking beneath its enormous weight. Tommy wanted to scream, but no sound came. He couldn't move. The dinosaur tilted its head, inspecting the tiny human before it. Time slowed. Tommy could hear nothing but his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. Suddenly, the T-Rex let out a guttural snarl and lunged forward. A blur of movement shot from the trees. Tommy barely registered what happened next. A flash of blue, claws slicing through the air, and the deafening roar of another creature. The T-Rex reared back, its jaws snapping, but it was no longer focused on Tommy. A pack of velociraptors had descended. There were 4 of them, sleek and deadly, their scales shimmering in shades of blue and black. They moved with perfect coordination, circling the much larger predator. Their sickle-shaped claws clicked against the ground, and their guttural cries reverberated through the jungle. The leader of the pack, distinguished by a faint stripe of white along its back, snapped its head toward Tommy. For a moment, the boy thought it might attack him, but then its sharp gaze turned back to the T-Rex. It had other priorities. The raptors struck as one. One leaped at the T-Rex's side, clawing at its massive thigh. Another darted to its tail, snapping at the base and forcing the larger predator to whip around, roaring in rage. Tommy watched in awe, unable to look away. The raptors were fast, so fast, and they seemed to anticipate every move the T-Rex made. They darted in and out of its reach, clawing and biting before slipping back into the safety of the underbrush. The T-Rex let out an ear-splitting roar, thrashing wildly. One of the raptors was knocked aside, tumbling into the ferns with a pained screech. The others regrouped, snarling and circling again. It was clear the T-Rex was outmatched. With one final roar, it turned and crashed back into the jungle, retreating the way it had come. The raptors stood still, their heads snapping side to side as they listened. The leader growled softly, as if giving orders. Tommy remained frozen on the ground, too afraid to move or speak. Then the leader turned its piercing gaze back to him. Tommy felt a fresh wave of fear rise in his chest. Slowly, he scrambled backward on his hands and knees, trying to put space between himself and the pack. The raptor took a step forward, its claws clicking on the dirt. Please," Tommy stammered, his voice breaking. The raptor tilted its head, as if it were curious. It took another step forward, lowering its body to the ground so it was level with the boy. Its eyes were sharp, almost intelligent, but not cruel. Tommy's breath caught as the raptor extended its snout toward him, sniffing the air. He squeezed his eyes shut, waiting for the inevitable. But nothing happened. Instead, the raptor let out a low growl, soft, almost like a purr. It was calm, not threatening. Slowly, Tommy opened his eyes and looked up. The raptor was watching him, its head tilted again as if studying him. The other raptors stood nearby, waiting. The leader made a low chirping sound, and Tommy swore it was trying to communicate. "Why you saved me?" he whispered. The raptor blinked, its gaze steady. Tommy couldn't explain it, but something about the creature's demeanor reassured him. It wasn't like the T-Rex, wild and uncontrollable. These raptors were something else. Slowly, Tommy pushed himself to his feet, his legs trembling beneath him. The leader of the raptors stepped back, allowing him space. Tommy looked at the pack, unsure of what to do next. "Are you gonna eat me?" he asked quietly. The leader snorted, almost as if it were amused. Tommy let out a shaky breath and looked around. He was still lost, still alone, but now he had unlikely company. The raptors exchanged glances and made a series of soft chirps and clicks. Then, to Tommy's astonishment, the leader turned and began walking away, its long tail swaying behind it. The other raptors followed, but not before one of them paused and looked back at the boy. It chirped once, as if beckoning him. Tommy blinked. You want me to come with you?" The raptor chirped again, then turned and disappeared into the undergrowth. Tommy hesitated. Every instinct told him to stay put, but what choice did he have? He was alone in a jungle filled with predators. If these raptors had wanted to hurt him, they would have done it already. Taking a deep breath, Tommy took a step forward, then another. The jungle was silent except for the faint sound of the raptors moving ahead of him. "Wait for me," he called, stumbling as he ran to catch up. The raptors led him deeper into the jungle, their movements graceful and precise. They seemed to know exactly where they were going, weaving between trees and over fallen logs. Tommy struggled to keep up, but he refused to lose sight of them. After what felt like hours, the pack finally slowed. Tommy stumbled to a stop, panting. He looked up and gasped. The raptors had led him to a clearing, a safe haven hidden deep in the jungle. Sunlight poured through a break in the canopy, illuminating a crystal-clear stream that bubbled gently over smooth rocks. The ground was soft with moss, and colorful flowers dotted the edges of the clearing. It was beautiful, peaceful. The raptors spread out, some drinking from the stream while others lay in the grass, resting. The leader turned to Tommy, letting out another low growl. Tommy stepped forward, his fear finally fading. "Thank you," he whispered. The leader tilted its head, watching him. Tommy sat down near the stream, his exhaustion catching up with him. For the first time since he'd gotten lost, he felt safe. The raptors had saved him, protected him, and brought him here. As he closed his eyes, the leader of the pack settled nearby, its sharp gaze never leaving him. It would keep watch. For the first time in days, Tommy slept peacefully. When Tommy awoke, the sun was higher in the sky, and the clearing was bathed in warm golden light. For a moment, he didn't remember where he was. Then it all came rushing back. The T-Rex, the Velociraptors, and their unexpected rescue. He blinked and sat up, rubbing his eyes. The raptors were still there, scattered throughout the clearing. Some lounged in the grass, their sleek bodies partially hidden by the foliage. Others drank lazily from the stream, their sharp claws dipping into the water. The leader lay closest to Tommy, its amber eyes watching him like a silent guardian. Tommy felt a strange sense of comfort in their presence. It should have been terrifying, being surrounded by a pack of prehistoric predators. But it wasn't. Something about the way they moved, the way they acted, told him he wasn't in danger. He stood up, stretching his small limbs. "Hi," he said softly, his voice uncertain. The raptor leader tilted its head, responding with a low chirp. Tommy smiled faintly. "You're like my friends now, huh?" The raptor blinked slowly, as if acknowledging his words. Tommy's stomach grumbled, loud enough to make him wince. He clutched his belly and looked down. It had been too long since he'd eaten anything, and hunger gnawed at him relentlessly. "Ugh," he muttered. "I wish I had something to eat." As if they understood, the raptor stirred. The leader rose to its feet, its muscles rippling beneath its scaly hide. It let out a sharp series of chirps, and the others responded immediately. One by one, the raptors slinked into the jungle, disappearing silently into the shadows. Tommy frowned, watching them go. "Wait, where are you going?" The leader remained behind, its gaze still fixed on him. It let out a low, soothing growl, then turned and padded toward the edge of the clearing. With one last look back at Tommy, it slipped into the jungle, leaving him alone. Tommy sat back down, his brow furrowed. Were they abandoning him? He couldn't blame them if they were. Why would dinosaurs care about a little boy? He hugged his knees to his chest, trying to ignore the growing ache in his belly. Minutes passed, then an hour. Tommy's mind wandered as he stared at the rippling water in the stream. He thought about his parents, how worried they must be searching for him. Would they ever find him out here? A rustling sound broke through his thoughts. He snapped his head up, his heart racing. Were the raptors back? Or was it something else? Branches parted, and the raptor leader emerged, its mouth carrying something. Tommy squinted, trying to see. When the raptor approached, it dropped its prize at Tommy's feet. A small bundle of fruits, bright and colorful. Tommy blinked in astonishment. You brought me food?" The raptor let out a soft growl, nudging the fruits closer with its snout. Tommy hesitated, glancing at the leader before reaching out to pick one up. The fruit was strange, something he'd never seen before, but it smelled sweet, and his hunger overwhelmed his caution. He bit into it, juice running down his chin. It was delicious. Tommy devoured the fruit quickly, glancing up at the raptor between bites. "Thank you," he said, his voice full of wonder. "You really are my friends, huh?" The leader huffed softly, settling back on its haunches as it watched him eat. Moments later, the rest of the pack returned, emerging one by one from the underbrush. Each carried more food, fruits, roots, and even small animals they had hunted. They dropped their offerings near Tommy, forming a small pile of provisions. Tommy stared at them in disbelief. You're taking care of me." The raptors didn't respond, but their actions spoke volumes. Over the next few days, Tommy adjusted to life with the Velociraptor pack. They moved together as one unit, traveling through the jungle with an ease and grace that Tommy couldn't hope to match. Whenever he fell behind, one of the raptors would nudge him gently with its snout, urging him forward. They provided for him, hunting food and finding water. At night, they formed a protective circle around him, their watchful eyes scanning the darkness for danger. Tommy slept soundly, nestled against the raptor leader, whose warmth and steady breathing reassured him. He learned to trust them completely. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the jungle in shades of orange and purple, Tommy sat beside the leader near a small campfire. He had managed to start it earlier with sticks and rocks, a trick his father had taught him. The fire crackled softly, casting flickering shadows across the clearing. Tommy looked up at the raptor leader, its sharp features softened in the firelight. "You know," he said quietly, "you saved me. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come." The raptor tilted its head, as if it understood. Tommy sighed, resting his chin on his knees. "I just want to go home. I miss my mom and dad. They must be so scared." The leader let out a low rumble, its gaze steady. For a moment, Tommy thought he saw something in its eyes, something almost human. "I wish you could talk," Tommy murmured. "I bet you'd have a lot to say." The The raptor didn't respond, but it stayed close, its presence comforting. Suddenly, a distant noise broke the silence. Tommy's head shot up, his ears straining to hear. It was faint, but unmistakable, the whirring sound of helicopter blades. Helicopters! Tommy gasped, jumping to his feet. That's my parents. They're looking for me. The raptors tensed, their heads snapping toward the noise. The leader rose to its feet, its muscles coiled. Tommy turned to the pack, his eyes wide. You have to help me. They won't see me under all these trees. The leader stared at him for a moment, then let out a sharp series of chirps. The other raptors responded instantly, spreading out and moving toward the noise. The leader motioned to Tommy with its snout, urging him to follow. Tommy didn't hesitate. He ran alongside the pack, his heart pounding with hope. The helicopters grew louder as they approached, the sound reverberating through the jungle. Tommy could see glimpses of them through the breaks in the trees, dark shapes hovering above the canopy. The raptor leader suddenly stopped, turning to Tommy. It let out a sharp, commanding chirp, and the other raptors began clawing at the trees and bushes, clearing a path to a small hill. Tommy followed, scrambling up the incline. When he reached the top, he gasped. The hill overlooked a wide clearing, bathed in sunlight. The helicopters were circling above, their searchlights sweeping across the ground. Tommy cupped his hands to his mouth and shouted, I'm here, down here. The raptors joined him at the edge of the hill, their guttural cries echoing through the air. The leader let out a loud, piercing screech that carried far and wide. The helicopters slowed, their searchlights focusing on the hill. Tommy jumped up and down, waving his arms frantically. They see us, he cried, tears streaming down his face. They see us. The raptor leader stepped back, watching silently as the helicopters descended. Tommy turned to the pack, his chest heaving. You saved me, he whispered. I'll never forget you. The leader tilted its head, letting out a soft growl. The helicopters landed in the clearing, and people poured out, rescuers, his parents, and others. Tommy ran toward them, his legs carrying him faster than they ever had before. Mom! Dad! He shouted, tears streaming down his face. His mother dropped to her knees, sobbing as she scooped him into her arms. Tommy! Oh, Tommy! His father hugged them both tightly, his voice choked with emotion. We thought we lost you, son. How did you survive out here? Tommy looked back at the hill, his heart swelling. The raptor pack stood at the edge, silhouetted against the sunlight. The leader was at the front, its amber eyes watching Tommy one last time. They saved me, Tommy said softly, pointing. His parents turned, but by the time they looked, the raptors were gone, disappearing back into the jungle like ghosts. Tommy wiped his tears and smiled faintly. He knew the truth. They weren't just predators. They were protectors. As the rescuers whisked Tommy away, his heart ached with every step that pulled him farther from the velociraptors. His parents, clutching him as if afraid to let go, guided him toward the waiting helicopter. Rescue workers swarmed around him, some shouting questions, others checking him for injuries. The hum of the engines vibrated in the air, loud enough to drown out his thoughts. But as Tommy glanced back toward the hilltop where the raptors had stood moments earlier, the clearing felt empty, too quiet, like the jungle had swallowed them whole. Tommy, are you all right? Where were you? How did you survive out here? His father's voice broke through the noise, trembling with relief and confusion. Tommy opened his mouth, but the words felt stuck. How could he explain what had happened? Who would believe that a pack of velociraptors, creatures out of ancient history, had protected him, fed him, and ultimately saved him? Tommy paused, still staring back at the jungle. I had help. His mother cupped his face, tears streaking her cheeks. From who? What do you mean, sweetheart? Tommy hesitated. He wanted to tell them everything, to shout about the raptors and how they were more than monsters, more than hunters. But somehow, he knew the world wouldn't understand. The helicopters, the adults, the endless questions. They didn't belong in the same story as the gentle growls of the pack and the leader's amber eyes watching over him. From "Friends," he said softly. The word felt right. His mother hugged him tightly, assuming he meant some unseen rescuers who had disappeared into the wilderness. The adults bustled around, loading Tommy into the helicopter while the blades whirred louder, sending leaves and dirt swirling into the air. As the helicopter lifted off, Tommy pressed his face to the window, searching the jungle below one last time. There, just at the edge of the trees, he saw them, the Velociraptor leader standing tall and still, flanked by the rest of the pack. Their amber eyes glimmered in the fading sunlight, watching him leave. The leader let out a soft, mournful call that Tommy could almost hear over the roar of the engines. He pressed his hand against the glass. "Goodbye," he whispered. "Thank you." And then the jungle disappeared beneath the clouds, the raptors lost to the vastness of the earth. The days that followed were a whirlwind of attention. News of Tommy's miraculous rescue spread like wildfire. Newspapers and TV stations ran headlines about the lost boy of the jungle, describing his survival as nothing short of a miracle. Doctors were astonished at his health. Aside from minor scrapes and exhaustion, Tommy was perfectly fine. But the questions came nonstop. Reporters lined up outside the hospital room, cameras flashing whenever his parents gave updates. People wanted to know how he had survived, what he'd eaten, where he'd slept, and most importantly, who had saved him. Tommy sat quietly through it all, clutching the small wooden toy dinosaur his father had given him when he was younger. It was old and faded, the edges worn smooth from years of being held. "What happened out there, son?" his father asked one evening, sitting by his bedside. The room was quiet, the steady beep of hospital monitors filling the silence. Tommy glanced up at his father, his brow furrowed. "I told you, I had friends." His father sighed, raking a hand through his hair. "We just want to understand, Tommy. How did you survive for so long? You were alone out there." "I wasn't alone," Tommy said firmly. "They took care of me." His father frowned. "Whose son? Who are they?" Tommy looked down at the toy dinosaur in his hands. He traced its curved back with his finger, feeling the familiar grooves. "They were dinosaurs," he said quietly. His father froze. "Dinosaurs?" Tommy nodded. "Velociraptors. A whole pack. They saved me from the T-Rex. They brought me food. They kept me safe." The silence that followed was heavy. His father stared at him for a long moment before forcing a smile. "Dinosaurs, huh? You've got quite an imagination, Tommy." Tommy's heart sank. "It's true," he said, his voice rising. "They were real. They weren't scary. They were smart and nice. They saved my life." His father's smile faltered. "All right, son. Let's talk about this later, okay?" Tommy clenched the toy dinosaur tightly, frustration bubbling inside him. No one would believe him. They wanted a simple explanation, a human hero, a rational story. But the truth didn't fit neatly into the world they understood. The days turned into weeks, and eventually, life returned to normal. Tommy left the hospital and went home, where his parents tried to fill the house with laughter and warmth. But something inside Tommy had changed. He couldn't stop thinking about the Velociraptors, the way they moved, the way they watched him, the bond they had shared. At night, he would lie awake in bed, staring at the ceiling and imagining the jungle. He could almost hear the rustling leaves and the low, rumbling calls of the pack. He missed them more than he could say. One evening, as the sun set and painted the sky in fiery hues, Tommy wandered into his backyard. The grass was soft beneath his feet, and the air smelled of earth and flowers. He knelt down, tracing patterns in the dirt with his fingers. "They're out there," he murmured to himself. Somewhere, a soft breeze rustled the trees, and for a fleeting moment, Tommy thought he heard it. A distant chirp, almost like a whisper. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. "Is that you?" he whispered. The sound didn't come again, but Tommy smiled faintly. He knew, deep down, that the Velociraptors were still out there, watching, waiting, protecting. From that day on, Tommy carried the memory of the pack with him. He became fascinated with dinosaurs, reading every book he could find and drawing pictures of the raptors in his notebooks. But his drawings were different. His velociraptors weren't monsters with sharp teeth and claws. They were guardians, their eyes full of intelligence and kindness. Years passed and Tommy grew older, but he never forgot the pack. He often returned to the jungle in his dreams, running alongside the raptors as they moved like shadows through the trees. In those dreams, he wasn't afraid. He was home. Decades later, Tommy stood at the edge of a familiar jungle, the air thick with humidity and the smell of earth. He was no longer a small boy but a grown man, his face lined with age and his hair streaked with gray. He wore a faded backpack slung over his shoulders, and in his hand, he clutched the same wooden toy dinosaur he'd carried all those years ago. "I had to come back," he said softly, staring into the dense green wilderness. He stepped forward, his boots sinking into the soft ground. Birds called overhead, and insects buzzed in the underbrush. But the jungle felt the same, alive and timeless, as if no time had passed at all. Tommy pushed deeper into the jungle, his heart beating faster with every step. He didn't know what he was searching for, not exactly. Closure, perhaps. Or maybe he hoped, impossibly, that he would see them again. Hours passed, and the sun began to set, casting golden light through the trees. Tommy found himself standing in a familiar clearing, his breath catching in his throat. It looked exactly as he remembered, the stream, the hill, the way the light filtered through the branches. He sank to his knees, the toy dinosaur clutched in his hands. "Are you still here?" he whispered. The jungle was silent. Tommy sighed, his shoulders slumping. "I just wanted to say thank you," he murmured. "For everything." A rustling sound broke the silence. Tommy's head snapped up, his heart pounding. He squinted into the shadows, his pulse racing. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then, a figure stepped into the light. A familiar shape, sleek and powerful, with amber eyes that glowed like embers. The Velociraptor leader stood at the edge of the clearing, watching him. Tommy's breath caught in his throat. "You?" The raptor tilted its head, its gaze steady. More figures emerged from the shadows. One by one, the pack appeared, surrounding the clearing. They were older now, their scales marked with age, but they were still the same. Still strong, still silent, still watching. Tommy smiled, tears streaming down his face. "I knew you were real," he whispered. The leader stepped forward, stopping just a few feet from Tommy. It let out a low, familiar growl, a sound of recognition, of trust. Tommy reached out, his hand trembling, and for a moment, man and dinosaur stood together, connected by a bond that transcended time. "I never forgot you," Tommy said, "and I never will." The raptor blinked slowly, then turned and melted back into the jungle, the pack following silently behind. Tommy stood alone in the clearing, the jungle alive with sounds once more. But this time he wasn't sad. He knew they were still out there, guardians of the wild, protectors of the lost. And no matter what the world believed, he knew the truth. They were his friends. Years after Tommy's return from the jungle, his extraordinary experience remained a closely guarded memory. The world moved on, with people believing their version of the story, the lost jungle boy, miraculously found after days of survival on his own. But Tommy carried with him the truth about the velociraptors. Creatures out of time, guardians not monsters, their amber eyes forever etched in his mind. His fascination with dinosaurs had turned into a lifelong passion. As a teenager, he devoured every bit of knowledge about them, studying paleontology textbooks late into the night. He sketched raptors in his notebooks during school, creatures rendered with grace, beauty, and intelligence, far from the cold, monstrous interpretations everyone else saw. But even as his drawings filled the margins of his life, Tommy's heart ached for something deeper, the longing to return. As an adult, Tommy turned his childhood obsession into a career. He studied paleontology at university, quickly becoming known for his uncanny insights into dinosaur behavior. While others speculated about velociraptors as ruthless predators, Tommy always argued for something more. "There's a nuance to them," he would say in lectures, "something more intelligent than we give them credit for." Colleagues praised his imagination, but they quietly dismissed his theories as romanticized fantasies. After all, how could anyone prove such things about creatures lost to history? But Tommy knew. One day, decades after his rescue, a discovery rocked the world. A team of scientists stumbled upon a previously unexplored stretch of jungle, untouched by time, dense and thriving in isolation. News spread of strange findings. Footprints too massive to belong to any living animal, strange markings on trees, and sounds, low, guttural calls echoing through the canopy at night. They say there's something alive out there, a colleague muttered one evening as Tommy stared at the news. Could just be tigers, though. People love to exaggerate, but Tommy knew better. His heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the screen. The images showed blurred footprints embedded deep into the mud, three-toed, sharp-clawed. Velociraptor. It's them, Tommy whispered to himself. He couldn't ignore the pull. That night, Tommy booked his flight to the region, his hands trembling as he clicked the final confirmation. He told no one of his plans, afraid they would call him crazy. But something deep inside him whispered that this was where he needed to be. For weeks, he trekked through dense jungle alongside a small team of guides. The air was thick, the heat stifling. Nights buzzed with the sounds of wildlife, creatures moving unseen in the darkness. Tommy led the way, his senses sharp, following an unexplainable instinct as they pushed deeper into the wilderness. On the 13th day of the expedition, the group stumbled upon something extraordinary. Clearing. Tommy froze as the jungle opened up before them. Sunlight filtered through the trees, illuminating a landscape that felt untouched by time. Massive ferns towered overhead, their fronds casting shadows across the forest floor. The air was still, too still, like the jungle itself was holding its breath. And there, on the edge of the clearing, were the tracks. Three-toed, deep, recent. Tommy's heart raced. They're here, he whispered, his voice trembling. The guides exchanged nervous glances. What's here? One asked. But Tommy didn't answer. He stepped forward, crouching beside the prints and running his fingers across the impressions in the dirt. The edges were fresh, the shapes unmistakable. They belonged to creatures far larger than any predator alive today. Tommy stood and scanned the clearing, his eyes narrowing. I know you're here, he said softly, his voice carrying across the still air. Silence. The team muttered among themselves, their unease growing. Maybe we should head back, one guide suggested, his voice tight with fear, but Tommy held up a hand. Wait, a sound broke the silence. A low, rumbling growl, deep and resonant, coming from the treeline. The team froze, their eyes widening in terror. Tommy's pulse pounded in his ears, but he didn't feel fear. Instead, he felt something else, familiarity. Then they appeared. The velociraptors emerged from the shadows, one by one, their sleek bodies moving silently across the clearing. Their scales gleamed in the dappled sunlight, their eyes glowing with that same amber hue Tommy had never forgotten. The leader stepped forward, larger and more regal than the rest. Its gaze locked onto Tommy, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. It's you, Tommy whispered, tears stinging his eyes. The raptor tilted its head, as if recognizing him. Its low growl rumbled softly, a sound of acknowledgement, of memory. The guides stumbled backward, their fear palpable. What are those? One cried. We need to run. No, Tommy said firmly, his voice steady. Don't move. The raptors held their ground, watching the humans with unblinking eyes. Tommy stepped forward slowly, his hands held up in a gesture of peace. The leader didn't flinch. It simply watched him, calm and still. Tommy's voice trembled as he spoke. You remember me, don't you? The raptor blinked slowly, then let out a soft, low rumble, almost like a purr. Tommy smiled, tears streaming down his face. I knew I'd find you again. The rest of the pack moved closer, their movements fluid and graceful. The other humans watched in stunned silence as the raptors circled Tommy, sniffing the air around him. But there was no aggression in their movements, no sign of threat. They're not attacking, one guide whispered, his voice shaking. Tommy turned to look at them, a fierce determination in his eyes. Because they're not monsters. They never were. For hours, Tommy stood in the clearing, surrounded by the creatures the world had forgotten. He watched the raptors interact with one another, their behavior complex and intelligent, far beyond what anyone had ever imagined. They communicated with low calls and subtle movements, a language of their own that Tommy felt privileged to witness. The leader stayed close to him, its gaze never leaving his face. As the sun began to set, casting the jungle in golden light, Tommy knew it was time to leave. The raptors seemed to sense it too. The leader let out a low, mournful call, and the pack stepped back, retreating toward the shadows. Tommy placed a hand over his heart. "Thank you," he whispered, "for everything." The leader paused at the edge of the clearing, its amber eyes locking onto Tommy one last time. Then, with a final rumble, it turned and melted into the jungle, the pack following silently behind. Tommy stood alone in the clearing, his heart full and his spirit at peace. He had found them, his guardians, his friends, and he knew the world would never understand. But that was all right. Some bonds transcended explanation, existing only in the quiet spaces between man and beast, past and present. And as Tommy turned to leave the jungle, he carried with him a truth no one else would ever know. The Velociraptors were alive, and they were watching. The expedition team followed Tommy in silence as they left the clearing, their minds still grappling with what they had just witnessed. None of them dared to speak a word. How could they? What they had seen defied all logic, all understanding of the natural world. Once they returned to camp, the tension was palpable. The guides whispered in hushed tones, casting nervous glances at Tommy. One of them finally broke the silence, his voice tight with unease. What were those?" Tommy's face remained calm, though his heart was still pounding. "Velociraptors," he said softly. "Creatures we thought were long gone." The guide shook his head. "It's impossible. Dinosaurs? Alive?" Tommy met his gaze with a quiet intensity. "I know it's hard to believe, but you saw them with your own eyes. I don't expect you to understand, but this isn't the first time I've encountered them." The team stared at him in disbelief. "What do you mean?" one of the scientists asked. Tommy hesitated. For years, he had kept the truth buried deep inside, afraid of being called delusional or mad. But now, standing on the edge of a discovery that could change everything, he knew it was time to share his story. "When I was a boy," Tommy began, his voice steady, "I was lost in a jungle not far from here. I was just a child, scared, alone, completely vulnerable. And that's when I met them." The team listened, captivated, as Tommy told them about the day he was rescued by the Velociraptors. Their intelligence, their gentleness, the way they had watched over him as if he were one of their own. He described the way they had protected him, shielding him from danger and guiding him back to safety. "They aren't the monsters you see in movies," Tommy said firmly. "They're intelligent, social creatures, almost like a family. I owe them my life." The team exchanged glances, their skepticism slowly giving way to awe. "But how is that possible?" one of the scientists asked. "Dinosaurs went extinct millions of years ago." Tommy sighed. "I don't have all the answers. Maybe this part of the jungle is a remnant of something ancient, something untouched by time. Or maybe the world is far more mysterious than we've ever imagined." The group fell silent, each of them grappling with the weight of Tommy's words. Finally, one of the guides spoke up, his voice barely above a whisper. "What do we do now?" Tommy looked out at the darkening jungle, his mind racing. "We protect them," he said quietly. "We keep their existence a secret." The scientists stared at him in shock. "Are you serious?" one of them asked. "Do you have any idea what this discovery could mean?" The scientific world would lose its mind. Tommy turned to face them, his expression hard. "Exactly. If the world finds out about them, what do you think will happen? Do you think people will respect them? Protect them? No. They'll hunt them, capture them, exploit them. These creatures have survived here for millions of years. And if we reveal their existence, we'll destroy everything." The team fell silent, Tommy's words sinking in. Deep down, they all knew he was right. "They trusted me," Tommy said softly, his voice filled with emotion. "They trusted me as a child, and they trusted me again today. I won't betray that trust." After a long pause, the team finally nodded in agreement. One by one, they swore to keep the secret safe, to leave the jungle untouched and the velociraptors undisturbed. For the rest of the expedition, the team avoided the clearing, respecting the creature's territory. Tommy spent his evenings staring into the fire, his mind filled with memories of the pack. He knew he would never see them again, but that was all right. They were safe, and that was all that mattered. When Tommy finally returned to civilization, he carried the weight of his secret with quiet pride. He gave no interviews, wrote no papers, and told no one about what they had discovered. Instead, he continued his work as a paleontologist, dedicating his life to studying the creatures he loved so much. Years passed, and Tommy became a respected figure in the scientific community. His theories about dinosaur behavior, once dismissed as fanciful, began to gain traction as new discoveries revealed their complexity and intelligence. Though he never spoke of his experience, his work was shaped by it, driven by a deep respect for the creatures that had once saved his life. As an old man, Tommy often found himself returning to the jungle in his dreams. He would see the clearing bathed in sunlight, the velociraptors watching him with those amber eyes. In his heart, he knew they were still there, hidden, safe, and alive. One evening, as the sun set outside his window, Tommy sat at his desk, staring at an old sketch he had drawn as a child. It was a picture of the leader of the pack, its head tilted as it watched over him. Tears filled his eyes as he traced the lines of the drawing, his heart overflowing with gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice trembling. In the end, Tommy's life was defined not by fame or recognition, but by the quiet bond he had shared with the creatures that time had forgotten. He had seen them not as monsters, but as guardians, intelligent, beautiful, and full of life. And as he closed his eyes for the final time, he imagined himself back in the clearing, the sunlight warm on his face, surrounded by the creatures that had once saved him. They were waiting for him, their amber eyes glowing softly in the shadows. The leader stepped forward, letting out a low, rumbling call, a sound of welcome, of recognition, of home. Tommy smiled as the world faded away, his spirit finally at peace. In the heart of the jungle, the velociraptors watched the clearing, their quiet existence undisturbed. For millions of years, they had survived, hidden from the world. And thanks to Tommy, they would continue to do so. Some secrets, after all, were meant to be kept.